30 minutes after the cardboard delivery box is opened, the regret begins to set in. The initial rush of salt, sugar, and engineered fats fades rapidly, replaced by a heavy, distended sensation in the abdomen. The stomach feels tight, expanding like an inflated balloon against the rib cage. A lethargic fog settles over the brain, a phenomenon commonly dismissed with the playful term food coma, but the biological reality is far more alarming. This sensation is not the natural feeling of satiety. This is an acute immune response. The modern body is struggling to process a substance that the digestive system does not recognize as food. The commercial pizza dough, consumed moments ago, is currently acting as a chemical sponge in the gut, demanding massive amounts of water to hydrolyze unfermented proteins that should have been broken down days ago. The consumer reaches for water, feeling a desperate thirst, yet the bloating only increases. The body is in a state of metabolic distress. Contrast this modern paralysis with the physical reality of the medieval peasant. A field worker in the year 1250 AD consumed approximately 1.5 kilograms of bread every single day. This carbohydrate intake was massive by modern standards, enough to terrify a modern nutritionist. Yet, historical records, skeletal analysis, and medical texts from the period show little evidence of the chronic obesity, the metabolic syndrome, or the widespread gluten intolerance that plagues the 21st century population. The medieval worker did not suffer from the post-meal crash. The medieval worker did not require a nap after the midday meal. The bread provided sustained, slow-release energy for 12 hours of hard manual labor in the fields. The difference lies not in the genetics of the human, but in the lost biology of the grain. The medieval ancestor of the pizza was not a soft, fast food treat designed for instant gratification. The dish was a functional tool known as the trencher. Before ceramic plates became common for the lower classes, the meal was served on a stale, dense, flat slab of sourdough bread. The trencher was a vessel. The trencher absorbed the grease, the sauces, and the juices of the roasted meat. The bread held the structural integrity of the meal, acting as an edible plate that could withstand moisture without disintegrating. At the end of the feast, the trencher was either eaten, soaked with deep flavor, or given to the dogs and the beggars as a calorie-dense ration. This was the original pizza foundation. But unlike the modern delivery crust, the trencher had undergone a transformation that modern science is only now beginning to revalidate. The medieval peasant was eating a product of chemistry, not just a product of agriculture. The paradox is stark and disturbing. The modern consumer has access to the most advanced temperature-controlled ovens, the purest white flour, and the cleanest water in history. Yet, the modern food industry produces bread that destroys the gut health of the population and triggers autoimmune responses. The medieval baker, working with unpredictable wood-fired stone ovens and variable grain quality often mixed with grit, produced a staple food that sustained civilization for 1,000 years. The disconnect is not an accident. The disconnect is a profitable design feature of the industrial food system. The sickness is the business model. The industry secret is simple but devastating. The modern food giant stole time. In the quest for maximum profit margins, the natural fermentation process, which requires 24 to 48 hours of floor time, was deemed inefficient. Nature cannot be rushed on an assembly line that demands thousands of units per hour. To bypass the clock, the industry introduced a biological imposter, Saccharomyces cerevisiae, isolated commercial baker's yeast. This single-strain organism is designed for one purpose only: speed. The commercial yeast pumps carbon dioxide into the dough at an explosive rate, inflating the bread like a balloon in under 60 minutes. The loaf looks like bread. The loaf smells like bread. But chemically, the loaf is raw grain. The biological pre-digestion process has been skipped entirely. When the modern consumer eats this quick-rise dough, The human stomach is forced to do the heavy lifting that the bacteria should have done in the mixing bowl. The stomach acid attacks the gluten network, which remains a tight, steel cable structure because the fermentation never uncoiled the complex proteins. The result is inflammation. The result is the leaky gut syndrome, where undigested proteins breach the intestinal wall, alerting the immune system to attack. The modern pizza is a lie wrapped in cheese. The consumer is eating a chemistry experiment that failed to complete the reaction. Furthermore, the deception goes deeper than just the yeast. To compel the raw flour to behave like finished bread, the industry adds dough conditioners, chemical agents such as azodicarbonamide, a chemical also used in the manufacturing of yoga mats and shoe rubber, are added to bleach the flour and artificially strengthen the gluten. The modern pizza crust is a masterpiece of cosmetic engineering, designed to look golden and fluffy while lacking any nutritional bioavailability. The medieval baker had no such chemicals. The medieval baker had only 3 ingredients: flour, water, and time. And of these 3, time was the most critical ingredient. The thesis of this investigation is that the medieval method was not merely a recipe to be found in a cookbook. The medieval method was a necessary survival technology. The ancient baker was a master of applied microbiology, utilizing an invisible workforce of wild bacteria to unlock the nutrients in the wheat and neutralize the anti-nutrients. This knowledge was discarded for the convenience of the drive-thru, but the consequences are visible in the health statistics of the modern world. To reclaim health, the modern individual must understand what was lost. The investigation must go deep into the chemistry of the bubble, the structure of the gluten, and the forgotten patience of the past. Has the modern stomach ever felt truly at peace after a meal, or is the post-meal bloat accepted as normal? That bloating is the sound of the gut screaming against a modern error. The investigation will now dismantle the modern pizza and reconstruct the ancient reality. The investigation must first strip away the most visible lie of the modern pizza, the red sauce. Walk into any supermarket or fast food chain in the 21st century, and the definition of pizza is inextricably linked to the tomato. This association is a historical fabrication. The tomato is a New World fruit, unknown to the medieval European baker. The tomato did not arrive in Italy until the 16th century, and even then, the fruit was feared as poisonous for generations. The original medieval pizza, the trencher, was a white pizza, or pizza bianca. The trencher consisted of dough, fat, herbs, and perhaps cheese. There was no acidic red paste to hide the flavor of the grain. This historical distinction exposes a massive modern failure. The modern industrial pizza relies on the tomato sauce, not for tradition, but for concealment. The heavy application of high-fructose corn syrup and concentrated tomato acidity acts as a sensory distraction. The sauce masks the complete lack of flavor in the crust. Modern quick-rise dough, produced in under an hour, tastes like cardboard or raw starch. The dough has no character, no tang, and no complexity, because the dough is biologically dead. The industry uses the sauce to shout over the silence of the bread. In the medieval era, without the overwhelming mask of the tomato, the bread had to stand alone. The flavor of the trencher came from the grain itself. This flavor was the byproduct of a complex biological war happening inside the dough. If a medieval baker produced a loaf that tasted like modern Wonder Bread, the village would have considered the baker a fraud. The modern palate has been trained to accept a bland, white sponge as a vehicle for toppings, completely forgetting that the crust was intended to be the nutritional powerhouse of the meal. The failure extends beyond the sauce into the molecular structure of the dough itself. Modern industrial baking prioritizes one metric: volume. How big can the loaf get in the shortest amount of time? To achieve this, the industry utilizes high-speed mixing and chemical oxidizers. These processes force air into the gluten structure mechanically rather than biologically. The result is a chaotic, weak gluten network that requires even more chemicals to hold the shape. The ingredient list of a frozen pizza crust often reads like a chemistry textbook. L-cysteine, derived from human hair or duck feathers, datum, and mono, and diglycerides. These are not food. These are structural supports for a collapsing architecture. The modern pizza crust is a building made of styrofoam and glue, painted to look like stone. To understand how the medieval peasant survived on a diet of 90% bread without suffering from modern metabolic diseases, the investigation must zoom in to the microscopic level. The medieval baker was not cooking alone. The medieval baker was the keeper of a zoo. This zoo was the levain or the sourdough starter. Unlike the sterile packets of isolated yeast used today, the levain was a wild, bubbling culture containing a chaotic ecosystem of wild yeasts and distinct bacteria. The primary worker in this ancient factory was not just yeast, but lactobacillus. This bacterium is the same genus found in yogurt and the human digestive tract. When the medieval baker mixed flour and water and left the mixture to sit for a day, the lactobacillus began to feed on the sugars in the grain. As the bacteria consumed the sugar, the bacteria excreted lactic acid and acetic acid. This is the sour in sourdough. This acidity was not just a flavor profile. The acidity was a chemical key. Grain, specifically wheat, contains a formidable defense mechanism known as phytic acid. Phytic acid is an anti-nutrient. Phytic acid binds to essential minerals like iron, zinc, magnesium, and calcium, locking these minerals away so that the seed can survive until germination. When a human eats unfermented grain like modern quick-rise bread, the phytic acid remains intact. The phytic acid binds to the minerals in the human gut and steals them from the body. The modern consumer is eating the bread, but the body is starving for minerals. The medieval fermentation process unlocked the vault. The lactic acid produced by the lactobacillus lowers the pH of the dough. This acidic environment activates a dormant enzyme in the wheat called phytase. The phytase enzyme acts as a biological key, unlocking the phytic acid bonds and releasing the minerals. By the time the medieval trencher went into the oven, the minerals were fully bioavailable. The bread had been transformed from a mineral blocker into a mineral supplement. The modern industrial loaf, fermented for only 30 minutes, never reaches the acidity level required to wake up the phytase. The modern loaf remains a locked vault. Furthermore, this microscopic workforce performs a process known as pre-digestion. The gluten protein, the villain of the modern diet, is a tough, complex chain of amino acids. For the human stomach, breaking down raw gluten is like trying to chew through a leather belt. However, in a long fermentation medieval dough, the bacteria and wild yeast begin to break down these protein chains long before the bread is baked. The bacteria use their own enzymes to snip the leather belt into smaller, manageable peptides. When the medieval peasant ate the trencher, the most difficult work of digestion had already been done in the mixing bowl. The gut did not need to struggle. The nutrients were absorbed efficiently. The modern consumer, eating a pizza crust that was mixed and baked in an hour, forces their stomach to attack full-strength, raw gluten. The immune system recognizes this alien protein structure as a threat and launches an inflammatory attack. The bloating is the battlefield. The fatigue is the collateral damage. The medieval baker did not know the words phytase or lactobacillus, but the medieval baker understood the rhythm of nature. If the dough did not smell sour, the dough was not ready. If the dough did not sit for the full cycle of the sun and the moon, the dough was not food. This was a technology of patience. It was a chemical mastery that converted a hard, indigestible grass seed into the fuel that built cathedrals. Modern science has replaced this biological wisdom with a packet of powder and a timer, and the human body is paying the price for this efficiency. The skeptics of the modern age often dismiss the medieval method as primitive superstition. They claim that our ancestors ate this way simply because they lacked technology. But the archaeological record provides a stark counter-argument. We look to the shadow of Mount Vesuvius. In the ruins of Pompeii, buried under volcanic ash in 79 AD, archaeologists discovered the panis quadratus. These are loaves of sourdough bread, carbonized instantly by the heat, preserved for nearly 2,000 years. When these loaves were analyzed, the structure told a story of density and nutrition. The crumb was not the airy, cotton candy texture of a modern supermarket loaf. It was substantial. It was a complex network of fermented grain. This bread was not a side dish. It was a survival ration capable of sustaining a legionnaire on a 20-mile march. Furthermore, in the Viking settlements of York, excavations have revealed remains of flatbreads made from barley and rye. These were not refined white powders. These were whole, brutal grains that had been tamed by fermentation. The evidence suggests that for thousands of years, humans did not just eat grain. They processed it biologically to make it safe. Modern science has finally caught up to this ancient wisdom. A landmark study conducted by the Department of Soil, Plant and Food Sciences at the University of Bari in Italy provided the definitive proof. Researchers took wheat flour and subjected it to a long-duration fermentation using a traditional sourdough culture of lactobacillus and wild yeast. They found that after 24 hours, the concentration of gluten peptides, specifically the ones toxic to celiac patients, had been degraded to almost zero. The bacteria had literally disassembled the toxic components of the gluten. The study suggested that for many people with mild gluten sensitivity, the enemy is not the wheat itself. The enemy is the speed of the process. We have stripped the grain of its natural antidote. The sourdough culture is not just a flavor additive. It is the external stomach of the human race. We outsourced our digestion to the jar, and when we threw away the jar, we broke our own gut health. How does the modern individual reclaim this lost technology? The industry wants the consumer to believe that baking is difficult, that it requires precise packets of instant yeast and sugar. This is a lie designed to create dependency. To create a medieval starter, one needs only two things: flour and water. There is no need to buy yeast. The air we breathe is thick with wild yeast spores. The flour itself is coated in the dormant bacteria of the field. The protocol is simple, almost insulting to the modern consumer. Mix equal parts flour and water in a jar. Cover it with a cloth to let the air in, but keep the flies out. Wait. In 24 hours, nothing will happen. In 48 hours, a few bubbles will appear. This is the resurrection. This is the invisible zoo waking up. By day 5, the mixture will rise and fall with a rhythmic breath. It will smell of vinegar and fruit. You have not cooked. You have trapped a wild ecosystem. This culture, if fed flour and water, is biologically immortal. There are starters in the bakeries of San Francisco and the monasteries of Belgium that have been kept alive for over 120 years. They are living links to the past. But the biology is only half the equation. The second half is the physics of the heat. The medieval trencher was cooked in a wood-fired masonry oven. This was not merely a choice of fuel. It was a utilization of thermal mass. The stones of the oven absorbed heat for hours, storing it as a battery stores electricity. When the dough was placed on the floor of the oven, the heat transfer was conductive and explosive. This intense, stored heat created the oven spring. It caused the water inside the dough to vaporize instantly, blasting open the internal structure of the bread before the crust hardened. This is the Maillard reaction at its peak, the caramelization of sugars and amino acids that creates flavor. The modern home oven, a thin metal box heated by electric coils, relies on convection, moving hot air. It dries the bread out rather than baking it. To mimic the medieval physics, the modern baker must use a heavy pizza stone or a cast iron skillet. We must reintroduce the thermal mass that the modern appliance lacks. Finally, we must look at the mathematics of survival. The economic model of the modern pizza is a tax on ignorance. A large commercial pizza costs $20. The ingredients, cheap flour, chemical yeast, and processed cheese, cost the corporation pennies. The consumer pays for the branding, the speed, and the delivery. Now, calculate the cost of the medieval way. A bag of high-quality, unbleached flour costs $5 and can produce 10 pizzas. The wild yeast from the air costs $0. The water costs $0. The cost is time. But this is the paradox. The active working time to mix a sourdough dough is less than 15 minutes. The rest is waiting. The rest is letting the biology do the work while you sleep. The modern consumer works extra hours at a job they hate to pay for expensive, fast food that makes them sick. The medieval craftsmen invested patience to create food that made them strong. Which one is truly the master of their economy? There is a prevalent arrogance in the modern world, a quiet assumption that history is a linear march from darkness into light. The modern individual looks back at the medieval ancestor and sees a primitive creature, shivering in the mud, ignorant of science, living a life that was nasty, brutish, and short. This perspective is not only arrogant, it is factually incorrect. The investigation into the sourdough trencher reveals a different truth. The medieval peasant was not a savage. The medieval peasant was a master of applied physics and practical biology. They did not have electron microscopes, yet they managed to harness an invisible microbial workforce to neutralize toxins in their food. They did not have thermometers, yet they mastered the thermodynamics of stone ovens to extract maximum nutrition from limited resources. The modern definition of technology is too narrow. We define technology as electronics, silicon chips, and digital networks. But a sourdough starter is technology. It is a biological machine, engineered through observation and selection over thousands of years, designed to process raw energy into human fuel. When the modern world discarded this technology in favor of the chemical shortcut, we did not advance. We devolved. We traded a complex, symbiotic relationship with nature for a sterile, industrial dependency. We have exchanged the wisdom of the craftsman for the convenience of the consumer. This shift has had profound consequences on the human condition. To be a consumer is to be passive. The consumer waits for the delivery. The consumer trusts the label. The consumer outsources the responsibility for their own survival to a corporation that prioritizes shareholder value over human health. The result is a population that is overfed but undernourished, surrounded by food-like substances but starving for real nutrients. The bloating, the inflammation, and the metabolic diseases are the physical manifestations of this loss of control. To return to the medieval method is not an act of nostalgia. It is an act of rebellion. Keeping a jar of wild yeast on the counter is a declaration of independence from the industrial food chain. It is a refusal to eat the dead dough that the factories churn out. When the individual takes flour and water and time and creates a meal that is digestible, nutritious, and deeply flavorful, they step out of the role of the passive consumer. They reclaim the title of the craftsman. The medieval way teaches that there are no shortcuts to quality. The fast in fast food is a theft. It steals the time required for chemistry to happen, and the debt is paid by the human body. The pizza was never meant to be a disk of plastic cheese and chemical dough delivered in 30 minutes. The pizza was meant to be the trencher, a testament to the patience of the harvest, the heat of the fire, and the invisible life of the fermentation. The path forward is actually the path back. Do not let the industry dictate the standard of what is possible. The tools are simple. The science is undeniable. The bacteria are waiting in the air right now, ready to work. The question is not whether the modern individual has the time to bake. The question is whether the modern individual can afford the health cost of continuing to rush. Stop eating the lie. Build the fire. Trust the bacteria. Become the master of your own bread.